My name is Rachel Stewart. I'm 35 years old. And at my father's funeral, surrounded by 400 mourners who had come to pay their respects to the man I loved most in this world, my mother stood up during the eulogy portion and announced she was giving my $1.4 million inheritance to my stepchildren instead, because they need it more than I do. What she didn't know was that her cruel theft from her grieving daughter, delivered at the most sacred and vulnerable moment of my life, was about to trigger a legal reckoning that would expose her true character to everyone who witnessed her betrayal and cost her everything she thought she could steal from me. The devastation of losing my father, David Stewart, had already brought me to my knees before Patricia's betrayal made everything infinitely worse. David was 58 years old, a brilliant commercial real estate developer who had built his business empire from absolutely nothing, starting with a single small office building and growing it into one of the most respected development companies in our state. He died suddenly of a massive heart attack while reviewing construction plans at his office on a Tuesday morning, collapsing at his desk while his secretary was bringing him coffee. One moment he was planning our annual family vacation to Ireland, excitedly showing me brochures of castles and countryside he wanted us to explore together. And the next moment, I was getting a frantic call from his secretary saying he had collapsed and the paramedics couldn't revive him. The shock of losing him so suddenly and unexpectedly felt like having my entire world ripped away without warning, leaving me struggling to breathe through grief so overwhelming it physically hurt. David wasn't just my father. He was my mentor, my biggest supporter, my closest friend, and the one person in this world I could always count on for unconditional love and unwavering belief in my potential. He had been there for every important moment of my life, from elementary school science fairs where he helped me build elaborate projects, to my high school graduation where he cried with pride, to my college commencement where he bragged to strangers about my marketing degree, to the launch of my consulting business where he provided both financial support and strategic advice. Rachel, you have the kind of brilliant mind that can solve any problem life throws at you, he used to tell me during our weekly dinner dates that had become sacred tradition. Don't ever let anyone convince you that you're not capable of achieving whatever you set your mind to accomplish. You're going to do amazing things in this world, and I'm going to be proud to watch every single success. His sudden death left a void in my life that felt impossible to fill, but I had been sustained during those first devastating weeks by knowing that his love and support would continue through the inheritance he had so carefully and thoughtfully planned. David had always been meticulous about his estate planning, regularly updating his will with his attorney and discussing his wishes with me to ensure I understood his intentions completely. Everything I've built through years of hard work is going to be yours someday, sweetheart, he had told me just 6 months before his death during one of our Sunday morning coffee conversations. I want you to use that money to expand your consulting business, maybe start a family if you decide you want children, buy the house you've been dreaming about, and live the life you've always envisioned. That's what would make me happiest, knowing that my life's work is helping you build your future. The inheritance consisted of his extensive real estate holdings, carefully managed investment accounts, business assets, and liquid savings worth approximately $1.4 million total. It represented not just money, but also his life's work, his dreams for my future, and his desire to provide security and unlimited opportunities for whatever path I chose to pursue. The will was clear, specific, and legally bulletproof, with detailed instructions about how the assets should be distributed and managed. My relationship with Patricia and her adult children had always been complicated by underlying tensions that David tried his best to navigate diplomatically. Patricia had remarried when I was 22, bringing 3 stepchildren into our family: Emma, Sophie, and Michael Thompson, who were 28, 26, and 30 respectively when she married David. They were fully grown adults with their own lives when she became part of our family, and while David had been kind and welcoming to them, they had never been particularly close to him or shown much interest in being part of our family beyond holiday gatherings and occasional social events. Patricia had always harbored resentment about the close relationship David and I shared, often making passive-aggressive comments about how he spoiled me or gave me too much attention compared to her own children. When she married David, She seemed to expect that his love, attention, and financial resources would be immediately redistributed to include her children equally, despite the fact that they were adults with established lives who had never lived in our household or developed meaningful relationships with him. David needs to remember that he has other children now too, Patricia would say, whenever she felt David was being too generous with his time, attention, or financial support toward me. Emma, Sophie, and Michael are part of this family now, and they deserve the same consideration and investment that Rachel gets from him. But David had always been crystal clear about his priorities and his intentions regarding his estate. I was his biological daughter, the child he had raised from birth, supported through every stage of development, and loved unconditionally throughout my entire life. His estate planning reflected that deep, irreplaceable relationship. He cared about Patricia's children and treated them with kindness and respect, but he didn't consider them his heirs in the same way he considered me his legacy. Have you ever noticed how some people enter your family, expecting to immediately receive the same love, attention, and financial benefits that others have earned through decades of relationship building and shared history? That's exactly what I observed with Patricia's expectations about David's treatment of her adult children, and her growing resentment when reality didn't match her assumptions. The week leading up to the funeral had been a complete blur of arrangements, condolences, media attention because of David's prominence in the business community, and overwhelming grief that made it nearly impossible to focus on practical matters or make coherent decisions. Patricia had taken charge of all the funeral planning, which I deeply appreciated since I was too emotionally devastated to handle the complex logistics of organizing such a large memorial service for someone as well known and respected as David. "Don't worry about a single thing, Rachel," Patricia had said while we were meeting with the funeral director to discuss arrangements. "I'll handle all the planning, coordinate with the church, manage the catering, and take care of every detail. You just focus on your grief and getting through this incredibly difficult time." Her support had seemed genuine and maternal, exactly what I needed during the most devastating period of my life. I was grateful to have someone taking care of the overwhelming details while I struggled to process the reality of David's death and tried to function despite grief that felt physically crushing. The funeral service was held at the largest and most prestigious church in our city, with over 400 people in attendance, including David's business associates, lifelong friends, extended family members, city officials, and community leaders whose lives he had touched through his work and extensive philanthropy. The outpouring of love, respect, and genuine grief for David was both overwhelming and deeply comforting, showing me just how many people had valued his character, integrity, and contributions to our community. I sat in the front row wearing the elegant black dress that David had complimented when I wore it to a business dinner with him just 6 months earlier, trying desperately to maintain composure while speaker after speaker shared beautiful memories of his kindness, his business acumen, his commitment to ethical practices, and his dedication to making our city a better place for everyone. The service was a beautiful and fitting tribute to a man who had lived with purpose, integrity, and genuine love for others. Every speech reinforced what I already knew, that David had been an extraordinary person whose impact on the world extended far beyond his business success to include the lives he had touched and the positive changes he had created. But then came the moment that would forever shatter my understanding of Patricia's character and her respect for David's memory, delivered with a cruelty and timing that still takes my breath away. During the eulogy portion of the service, when family members were invited to share personal memories and reflections about David's life and legacy, Patricia walked up to the podium with a confident stride and determined expression that should have warned me something terrible was about to happen. David was a wonderful man who always put family first and taught us the importance of taking care of those who need our help most, Patricia began, her voice carrying clearly through the church's professional sound system to every person in that packed auditorium. He would want his legacy to continue that tradition of generosity, compassion, and support for family members who are struggling. The words sounded appropriate and loving, exactly what people would expect to hear from a grieving widow honoring her deceased husband's memory and values. But something in her posture, her tone, and her facial expression was making me increasingly uncomfortable, though I couldn't identify exactly what was bothering me about her demeanor or where she was heading with her comments. That's why I've decided that David's estate should go to those family members who need it most rather than those who are already successful," Patricia continued. And I felt cold dread beginning to settle in my stomach as I realized she was talking about the inheritance that had been specifically and legally designated for me in David's carefully planned will. What happened next would be burned into my memory forever, as the moment when grief and betrayal collided in the most devastating and publicly humiliating way I could have imagined. David would have wanted his money to go where it's needed most, Patricia announced from the church pulpit, her voice steady and confident as if she was sharing a generous and wise decision rather than committing theft in front of 400 witnesses who had come to honor my father's memory. "My other children, Emma, Sophie, and Michael, need this financial support more than Rachel does. Rachel has always been independent and successful in her business, while they are still struggling to find their way in life and establish financial security. This redistribution is what your father would have wanted, and it's what I'm going to ensure happens." The silence that followed was so complete and profound that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears and the subtle hum of the church's air conditioning system. 400 people in that auditorium had stopped breathing simultaneously as they processed what they had just heard. A mother announcing at her husband's funeral that she was stealing her stepdaughter's inheritance, while that daughter sat grieving in the front row, still wearing black and mourning the loss of the most important person in her life. The shock was so overwhelming and unexpected that my mind couldn't immediately process what was happening. I was still surrounded by the physical reminders of David's death, his casket, the flowers, the photographs celebrating his life, the speakers sharing memories of his character and achievements. And in this sacred space, during this holy moment dedicated to honoring his memory, my stepmother was using the platform to announce that she was giving away the inheritance he had specifically designated for me in his legally binding will. Emma, Sophie, and Michael were sitting several rows behind me with other extended family members, and I could hear them whispering excitedly among themselves as they realized they were about to receive a financial windfall they had never expected or earned. Their reaction wasn't shock, discomfort, or concern about the inappropriate timing. It was gratitude, excitement, and satisfaction about their sudden dramatic improvement in financial circumstances. "Thank you so much, Patricia," Michael whispered loudly enough for people around him to hear clearly. "This means absolutely everything to us. We'll make sure to use this money in ways that would make David proud of our success." The immediate acceptance and enthusiastic gratitude from my stepfamily made the betrayal even more devastating and personally insulting. They weren't uncomfortable with the timing, the circumstances, or the ethical implications of what was happening. They were treating Patricia's announcement like a generous Christmas gift, rather than recognizing that they were witnessing theft from a grieving daughter at her father's funeral. Have you ever experienced a moment so shocking, inappropriate, and cruel that your mind couldn't process what was happening while it was occurring? That's exactly what I felt sitting in that church pew, surrounded by hundreds of mourners, listening to my stepmother steal my inheritance while justifying it as a reflection of my father's values and wishes. Sophie was practically bouncing in her seat with excitement, clearly already making mental plans for how she would spend money that legally belonged to me. "Patricia, you're so wise and generous," she said in a stage whisper that carried throughout the section. "David would be so proud of how you're taking care of all of his children equally." The false narrative about David's intentions and the characterization of Patricia's theft as equal treatment was being established and reinforced even as the announcement was happening, creating a version of reality that contradicted everything I knew about my father's actual wishes and legal planning. Meanwhile, Emma was wiping away tears that appeared to be tears of gratitude rather than grief, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden change in her financial prospects. The three of them were reacting to Patricia's announcement as if they had just won the lottery, rather than recognizing the devastating harm being inflicted on someone who was supposed to be their family member. The funeral service somehow continued around me, but I was no longer able to focus on the speakers, the tributes to David's memory, or the celebration of his life and achievements. I was trapped in a nightmare where my grief was being exploited, my father's wishes were being publicly violated, and my financial security was being stolen by the one person who should have been protecting both his legacy and my well-being during this vulnerable time. Patricia returned to her seat beside me with a satisfied expression, as if she had just delivered a beautiful and meaningful tribute to David's memory, rather than committing a devastating betrayal of his explicit wishes and legal instructions. She even reached over to squeeze my hand, apparently expecting me to appreciate her wisdom in redistributing the inheritance she had just stolen from me. "David would be so proud of this decision, Rachel," she whispered to me as the service continued with another speaker taking the podium. "He always believed in helping those who needed it most. And Emma, Sophie, and Michael really need this fresh start and financial security in their lives." The casual way she was justifying the theft while sitting beside David's casket was almost more shocking than the original announcement. She was treating her violation of his legally binding will as an act of generosity and wisdom rather than recognizing it as a betrayal of his explicit instructions, his trust in her as executor, and his daughter's legitimate inheritance rights. Meanwhile, I could see funeral attendees throughout the church turning to look at me with expressions of sympathy, confusion, discomfort, and in some cases, clear outrage at what they had just witnessed. They had come to honor David's memory and support his family during our time of grief, and instead they had witnessed something unprecedented, inappropriate, and deeply disturbing. Some people were clearly appalled by Patricia's announcement and the timing of her theft, while others seemed to be accepting her justification about helping family members who needed it more. The mixed reactions were creating an uncomfortable social dynamic where people weren't sure how to respond or what to say about such an extraordinary situation. As the remainder of the funeral service continued, several people who had known David well approached me with expressions of support and comments that subtly acknowledged what they had witnessed without directly challenging Patricia's actions in such a public setting. "Rachel, your father was so proud of you and spoke about you constantly," David's longtime business partner Robert whispered to me during a brief lull in the service. "He always said you were the best thing he had ever accomplished in his life, and his intentions for you were always crystal clear to everyone who knew him well. Have you ever received a message that provided comfort, while also validating your understanding of a situation that others were trying to distort?" That's exactly what I experienced as people who had known David intimately tried to reassure me that Patricia's announcement contradicted everything they knew about his actual wishes and values. The most devastating part of the remainder of the service was overhearing conversations where people discussed Patricia's announcement and what it revealed about family dynamics they had never been aware of before. The public nature of her betrayal had exposed private family matters that should never have been aired at a funeral, creating professional and social embarrassment that would follow me throughout my career and community relationships. As we prepared to leave the church for the graveside service, I realized that Patricia's theft hadn't just cost me my inheritance. It had also robbed me of the opportunity to grieve my father's death in peace, dignity, and privacy. She had turned his memorial into a public spectacle about money and family dynamics, creating drama and controversy that would forever be associated with his funeral and overshadow the celebration of his life and achievements. The drive to the cemetery was conducted in tense silence, with Patricia apparently assuming that I would accept her decision quietly, and Emma, Sophie, and Michael already making whispered plans for their windfall. But what none of them understood was that their public theft had been witnessed by hundreds of people, including legal professionals, business leaders, and community members who were appalled by what they had seen and would remember their behavior permanently. The graveside service that followed would prove to be even more devastating as I watched my stepfamily position themselves as David's primary mourners, while I felt like a stranger at my own father's burial, isolated by their theft and excluded from the inheritance that should have provided both financial security and a tangible connection to his legacy. The graveside service at David's burial was held at the historic cemetery, where 3 generations of his family had been laid to rest, surrounded by towering oak trees and elegant monuments that reflected the dignity and permanence he had always valued. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a peaceful and sacred conclusion to the formal mourning process, allowing family and close friends to say their final private goodbyes while celebrating his life in a more intimate setting. Instead, it became another stage for the devastating family drama that Patricia's announcement had created, as Emma, Sophie, and Michael positioned themselves prominently near the casket, as if they were David's primary mourners and most important survivors. They had apparently decided that their newly announced inheritance gave them special status at his burial, displacing me from the central role that should have been mine as his only biological child and closest family member. David was like a real father to all of us, Emma announced to the gathered mourners as we stood around the gravesite. We're so grateful that Patricia is honoring his memory by sharing his legacy with all of his children equally. It shows what kind of generous, loving man he was, and what kind of wise, compassionate woman Patricia is. The false narrative about David's relationship with my stepfamily and his intentions for his estate was being reinforced and expanded, while I stood just a few feet from his casket, too shocked and grief-stricken to challenge their claims publicly at his graveside. They were rewriting history in real time, presenting themselves as beloved stepchildren rather than acknowledging that they had been occasional visitors who had never developed meaningful relationships with him. Sophie was equally effusive in her praise for Patricia's wisdom and her excitement about the inheritance that had been stolen from me. David always made us feel like we were truly part of his family, she said to relatives and family friends who were listening with varying degrees of skepticism. Patricia's decision to include us in his legacy proves how much he cared about all of us, not just his biological daughter. The implication that David's love had been equally distributed among all of Patricia's children, rather than being primarily focused on me as the daughter he had raised from birth, was both historically inaccurate and personally devastating. They were using his death and his inability to defend his actual feelings to create a version of family relationships that suited their financial interests. Meanwhile, Michael was already discussing practical plans for the money they expected to receive, treating the graveside service as an opportunity to share their excitement about the financial opportunities that my stolen inheritance would provide them. I'm finally going to be able to start the consulting business I've been dreaming about for years, Michael told David's business associates who had come to pay their respects. David always encouraged entrepreneurship, and now he's giving me the capital I need to build something meaningful and successful. Have you ever watched people exploit a funeral as a networking opportunity to discuss their business plans, funded by money stolen from the deceased person's actual heir? That's exactly what I was witnessing as Michael used David's burial to promote his entrepreneurial aspirations, using my inheritance as startup capital. The irony of Michael claiming that David had always encouraged entrepreneurship was particularly galling, since David had indeed been passionate about supporting business development, specifically by mentoring me in my consulting practice and planning to leave me the resources to expand that business significantly. Michael was using David's genuine values to justify stealing the inheritance that was supposed to fund the very entrepreneurship David had actually supported. As the graveside service concluded and people began expressing their final condolences before leaving the cemetery, I found myself increasingly isolated and excluded from conversations about David's legacy and the family's plans for the future. Patricia and my stepfamily had managed to position themselves as the primary beneficiaries and decision-makers, while I was treated as a secondary figure whose grief was less important than their excitement. Rachel, I'm so sorry for your tremendous loss, Dr. William Chen, David's longtime physician and family friend, said as he approached me before leaving. Your father talked about you constantly during his medical appointments. He was incredibly proud of your business success and excited about your future plans. I know his hopes and dreams for you were always very specific and deeply personal. The subtle message was clear. People who had known David intimately understood that Patricia's redistribution of his inheritance contradicted everything they knew about his actual feelings and intentions. They were trying to provide comfort and validation without directly challenging Patricia's actions at such a sensitive time. But the most devastating moment came when Patricia approached me as the graveside service was ending, apparently expecting gratitude, or at least acceptance of her theft, now that it had been publicly announced and socially established among our family and friends. Rachel, I hope you understand that this decision was made out of love for the entire family, she said, placing her hand on my arm in a gesture that was probably meant to seem maternal, but felt manipulative and patronizing. David would want all of his children to be taken care of, and Emma, Sophie, and Michael need this financial support more than you do. The suggestion that I should be grateful for her theft, or that I should accept her justification based on her interpretation of David's values, was so offensive and emotionally devastating that I could barely formulate a response. She was asking me to validate her betrayal while I was still mourning the man whose wishes she had violated. "Mom, Dad specifically planned his estate to provide for my future," I managed to say quietly, trying to avoid creating an additional scene at his gravesite while still asserting the truth about his actual intentions. He discussed his plans with me many times over the years. He wanted his life's work to help me expand my business and build the life he knew I was capable of creating. David's plans were made before he fully understood how much Emma, Sophie, and Michael were struggling financially, Patricia replied, her tone becoming slightly defensive as she realized I wasn't going to accept her theft without question. If he were still alive today, he would want me to help them achieve stability and success. He was always generous with people who needed support. The logic was identical to what she had announced from the church pulpit, treating my success as disqualification from receiving the inheritance my father had specifically planned for me, while treating my stepfamily's lack of achievement as justification for receiving money they had never been promised or included in his estate planning. But what made her justification even more insulting and emotionally cruel was the way she continued to invoke David's memory and values to support decisions she knew he would never have made. She was using his death and his inability to defend his actual wishes as cover for stealing from his daughter and giving that money to people he had barely known. The conversation was interrupted by Emma, Sophie, and Michael, approaching us as they prepared to leave the cemetery, clearly wanting to express their gratitude to Patricia for her generosity and to begin making more detailed plans for their windfall. "Patricia, we can never thank you enough for this incredible gift," Emma said with tears of gratitude in her eyes. "David's legacy is going to change all of our lives in ways we never imagined possible. We want to make sure we use this money in ways that would honor his memory and make him proud of our achievements," Sophie added, apparently trying to sound thoughtful and responsible, while clearly being excited about the financial opportunities that my stolen inheritance would provide. The scene of my stepfamily thanking Patricia for stealing my inheritance while I stood beside David's grave was so surreal and emotionally devastating that I felt disconnected from reality. They were treating the theft as a generous family decision, rather than recognizing the legal and ethical violations they were celebrating. As I drove home from the cemetery, still wearing the black dress that had been appropriate for mourning my father but had also witnessed the theft of my inheritance, I made a decision that would change everything about my relationship with Patricia and my approach to protecting David's legacy and memory. I wasn't going to accept this betrayal quietly, hope that time would heal these wounds, or assume that Patricia's role as executor gave her unlimited authority to violate David's explicitly stated wishes. My father had raised me to stand up for what was right, to fight for justice even when it was difficult, and to honor the values and principles he had instilled in me throughout my life. If Patricia thought she could exploit my grief, steal my inheritance, and violate David's memory without facing serious consequences, she was about to learn that David had taught his daughter to be strategic, determined, and absolutely uncompromising when it came to protecting what was right and just. The woman who had stood in shocked silence at her father's funeral and graveside was about to become someone who would use every legal tool, strategic advantage, and professional resource available to honor his memory and ensure that his true wishes were respected rather than exploited by people who had no legal or moral right to his life's work. The days immediately following David's funeral and burial passed in a blur of conflicting emotions as I struggled to process both my overwhelming grief and the devastating betrayal that Patricia had inflicted during the most vulnerable moment of my life. The combination of losing the person I loved most in the world and discovering that my stepmother was willing to exploit that loss for her own children's benefit created a trauma that affected every aspect of my daily functioning and mental health. Sleep became nearly impossible as I replayed the funeral scene over and over in my mind, remembering Patricia's confident announcement from the church pulpit, the shocked faces of the hundreds of mourners, and Emma, Sophie, and Michael's immediate acceptance of their stolen windfall. The violation felt simultaneously deeply personal and publicly humiliating, creating emotional wounds that seemed to deepen rather than heal as time passed, and the reality of what had happened became more apparent. But alongside the grief, shock, and sense of betrayal, I was also experiencing something else that grew stronger each day. a burning anger at the injustice of what had happened, and an increasing determination to fight back against people who thought they could steal from me while I was vulnerable and grieving. David had raised me to be strong, strategic, principled, and absolutely relentless when fighting for what was right, and I was going to honor his memory by using those qualities to protect his legacy from people who would exploit it. The first step was understanding exactly what legal rights I had and what options were available for challenging Patricia's actions as executor of David's estate. I contacted James Wilson, David's longtime attorney and trusted advisor, who had subtly offered his support at the funeral reception and who understood better than anyone what David's actual intentions had been regarding his estate planning and my inheritance. "Rachel, I have to tell you that what Patricia announced at the funeral contradicts absolutely everything your father discussed with me during our decades of working together on his estate planning," James said during our first meeting in his law office. "David was incredibly clear, specific, and consistent that his assets should go to you, with detailed instructions about how he wanted those resources to support your future business expansion and personal financial security." The validation of my understanding of David's wishes was both comforting and infuriating, confirming that Patricia's actions represented a clear and deliberate violation of his explicit instructions, rather than just a difference of interpretation about his values or intentions. The legal reality was exactly what I had known it to be, despite Patricia's attempts to justify her theft. Patricia, as executor of David's estate, has specific fiduciary duties that require her to follow the will's instructions precisely and without deviation, James continued, pulling out copies of David's estate planning documents to show me the relevant sections. She cannot legally redistribute assets based on her personal opinions about who needs the money more or who deserves financial support. Her announcement at the funeral suggests she's planning to commit serious estate fraud. The legal terminology was stark and serious, but it accurately described what I had witnessed: a calculated plan to steal money that was legally designated for me and give it to people who had no legal claim to David's estate whatsoever. The crime was clear, documented, and witnessed by hundreds of people who had heard her announce her intentions publicly. What are my options for stopping this theft and ensuring that David's actual wishes are honored rather than violated? I asked, ready to take whatever steps were necessary to protect both my inheritance and my father's legacy from people who would exploit his death for their own financial benefit. "We can file for immediate court intervention to prevent any distribution of assets until Patricia's actions as executor can be reviewed by a judge," James explained. "We can also pursue criminal charges for estate fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit theft. The evidence is overwhelming, and the witnesses are numerous and credible. Have you ever felt the relief and empowerment that comes from learning you have strong legal recourse against people who thought they could exploit you without consequences?" That's exactly what I experienced as James outlined the comprehensive tools available for challenging Patricia's theft and protecting David's estate from her violations. But I wanted more than just legal remedies and financial recovery. I wanted Patricia and my stepfamily to experience the same kind of public accountability and social consequences they had forced upon me at David's funeral. They had chosen to make their theft a public spectacle witnessed by hundreds of people, and I was going to ensure their legal consequences were equally visible to the community that had observed their behavior. "James, I want to document everything they're doing and saying while they believe they're going to receive this stolen money," I said. "I want evidence of their attitudes, their plans, and their complete lack of respect for David's actual wishes or my legitimate rights as his heir." The strategic approach was something David would have appreciated and supported. Thorough preparation, careful documentation, comprehensive planning, and tactical execution designed to achieve maximum effectiveness while maintaining the highest ethical and legal standards throughout the process. Over the following 2 weeks, while Patricia and my stepfamily were apparently making detailed plans for spending the inheritance they thought they were about to receive, I was quietly building a comprehensive legal case that would expose their actions to public scrutiny and ensure they faced serious consequences for their exploitation of David's death and their theft from his grieving daughter. "We have multiple strong grounds for challenging Patricia's actions," James told me as we reviewed the evidence we had gathered. "The will is clear and legally bulletproof. We have numerous witnesses to David's expressed intentions over many years. Patricia's public announcement at the funeral demonstrates her deliberate intent to violate her fiduciary duties. And we have documentation of her stepchildren's premature spending based on their expectation of receiving stolen funds. The legal case was not only strong and comprehensive, but it was also supported by evidence that Patricia and my stepfamily had created themselves through their own words and actions. Their confidence in their ability to steal without consequences had led them to be careless about documenting their intentions and their premature celebration of their windfall. But I also wanted to gather additional evidence of their ongoing violations and document how they were treating this theft as a done deal rather than recognizing the serious legal and ethical problems with their actions. I arranged to have conversations with Patricia and my stepfamily, where I could carefully record their attitudes, plans, and justifications for what they were doing. "James, I want to document their own words about this theft," I explained. "I want recordings of them discussing their plans, justifying their actions, and demonstrating their complete lack of understanding about the legal consequences they're going to face." The strategic approach would provide additional evidence, while also giving them multiple opportunities to reconsider their actions and return the money voluntarily before facing the full legal consequences of their behavior. If they chose to continue with their theft, despite having chances to do the right thing, their legal punishment would be entirely self-inflicted. Over the next several weeks, I had multiple conversations with Patricia and my stepfamily, where I carefully documented their attitudes toward the inheritance, their detailed plans for using the stolen money, and their continued justification of their theft based on their personal assessments of who deserved David's life's work. "Rachel, you need to accept that this decision is final and that it's what David would have wanted," Patricia told me during one recorded conversation at her house. "Emma, Sophie, and Michael need this financial support to achieve stability and build successful lives, while you already have a thriving business and don't need the money as much as they do." The casual dismissal of my legal rights as David's heir and the continued invocation of his memory to justify her theft was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to demonstrate her unfitness as executor and her willingness to violate her legal obligations for her own children's benefit. Emma was equally revealing in her conversations, treating the inheritance as if it was already legally hers, and making detailed financial commitments based on money she had no right to receive. "I've already found the perfect house and put in an offer," Emma told me excitedly during a family dinner that I attended specifically to document their behavior. "The seller accepted my offer, and I'm planning to close on the purchase next month using David's money. I'm so grateful that Patricia recognized how much I needed this opportunity to achieve homeownership and financial stability." The premature spending and the assumption that the stolen money was already available for her use provided additional evidence of how my stepfamily was treating Patricia's announcement as a completed transaction, rather than recognizing the legal and ethical problems with their windfall. Sophie was making similarly premature financial commitments, booking expensive travel, and making purchases based on her expectation of receiving inheritance money that legally belonged to me. "I've planned a 3-month European vacation to celebrate this incredible gift," Sophie shared during another recorded conversation. "I've booked flights, hotels, and tours throughout Italy, France, and Spain. David's generosity is going to give me experiences I never could have afforded otherwise." Meanwhile, Michael was already investing in business equipment and making commitments for a consulting firm he planned to start using capital stolen from my inheritance. "I've ordered $50,000 worth of computer equipment and software for my new consulting business," Michael told me during a conversation he didn't realize was being recorded. "I've also signed a lease on office space and hired my first employee. David's legacy is going to help me build the successful company I've always dreamed of creating." The systematic documentation of their premature spending and their confident assumptions about receiving stolen money was creating a comprehensive legal record that would make their eventual prosecution much more straightforward and their financial penalties much more severe. But the most damaging evidence came during a conversation where Patricia explicitly acknowledged that she was knowingly violating David's wishes while justifying her actions based on her personal opinions about fairness, need, and family dynamics. "I know David intended for Rachel to inherit his estate," Patricia admitted during a conversation she didn't realize was being recorded. But that was before he understood how much Emma, Sophie, and Michael were struggling financially and emotionally. If he was still alive today and could see their situations, he would want me to help them, instead of giving everything to Rachel, who already has a successful career and doesn't really need additional financial support. The direct admission that she was knowingly violating David's wishes while substituting her own judgment for his legally binding instructions provided exactly the evidence I needed to prove intentional estate fraud and deliberate breach of fiduciary duty. Have you ever watched people incriminate themselves through their own words and actions while believing they were safe from consequences? That's exactly what was happening as Patricia and my stepfamily created a comprehensive legal record of their theft, their premature spending, and their complete lack of respect for David's actual wishes or my legitimate inheritance rights. 3 months after David's funeral, I was ready to execute a comprehensive legal strategy that would expose Patricia's theft, recover my stolen inheritance, and ensure that all of them faced consequences that matched the magnitude of their betrayal. The timing was perfect. My stepfamily was planning another celebration dinner to toast their new opportunities, funded by my stolen inheritance, providing the ideal setting for serving legal papers and beginning their education about the serious consequences of estate fraud. The celebration dinner they had planned was specifically designed to mark the beginning of their new lives funded by David's stolen money, scheduled for the same weekend when Emma's house purchase was supposed to close. Sophie's European vacation was set to begin, and Michael's consulting business was scheduled to officially launch. They had invited extended family and friends to witness their good fortune and celebrate Patricia's wisdom in redistributing the inheritance. But instead of celebration, they were about to experience the most devastating legal and financial reversal they could imagine, delivered with precision, documentation, and public impact that would match what they had inflicted on me at David's funeral. The celebration dinner that would change everything for Patricia and my stepfamily was held at an upscale restaurant that Emma had chosen to showcase her new financial status and to create an impressive setting for announcing their various successes funded by my stolen inheritance. They had reserved a private dining room for extended family and friends, planning an evening of toasts, congratulations, and public recognition of their sudden good fortune. I arrived at the dinner as invited, maintaining the appearance of reluctant acceptance of Patricia's decision, while secretly coordinating with James Wilson and his comprehensive legal team to ensure that every aspect of our response would be properly documented, legally sound, and witnessed by the same people who were celebrating their theft from David's estate. "Rachel, I'm so pleased you decided to join us tonight," Patricia said, as she welcomed me into the private dining room. "I hope this evening will help bring our family closer together and help you understand that what we're doing truly honors David's memory and reflects his values of generosity and family support. The suggestion that I should be grateful for their theft, or that their celebration somehow honored David's memory, was both insulting and perfect additional evidence of their complete lack of understanding about the legal and ethical implications of their actions. Every word they spoke was providing more documentation of their attitudes and intentions. The dinner guests included many of the same people who had attended David's funeral and witnessed Patricia's shocking announcement, creating an audience that would understand the full significance and justice of what was about to unfold. Emma, Sophie, and Michael had apparently shared detailed stories about their windfalls during the cocktail hour, generating congratulations and admiration for their sudden financial improvements and life changes. "Emma, we're so excited about your beautiful new house," one family friend was saying during the cocktail reception. "It must feel incredible to finally have this kind of financial security and home ownership after struggling with rent payments for so many years." "David's generosity is literally changing my entire life," Emma replied with genuine tears of gratitude in her eyes. "I never imagined I would be able to afford my own home, but Patricia's decision to share his legacy with all of us has made my dreams of stability and independence possible." The false narrative about David's generosity and Patricia's wisdom was being reinforced and celebrated throughout the evening, with guests offering praise and congratulations for what they believed was a family's loving decision to support struggling relatives through inherited wealth. Sophie was equally effusive about her upcoming European adventure, sharing detailed itineraries and expressing her excitement about the cultural experiences that my stolen inheritance would provide. "I've always dreamed of spending months exploring Europe and discovering different cultures," Sophie was telling David's former neighbors and business associates. David's legacy is giving me the freedom to take this time for personal growth and self-discovery. He would have loved knowing that his hard work is creating these incredible opportunities for all of us. Meanwhile, Michael was discussing his new consulting business with professional enthusiasm, presenting himself as an entrepreneur who had finally received the capital necessary to launch his long-planned venture. David always encouraged business development and entrepreneurial thinking, Michael was explaining to David's former business colleagues. Now he's giving me the resources to build something meaningful that will create jobs and serve our community. I'm honored to carry on his legacy of business excellence and community involvement. Have you ever watched people celebrate their good fortune while having absolutely no idea they were about to lose everything they thought they had gained? That's exactly what I was witnessing as my stepfamily accepted congratulations for successes they would never actually achieve and made detailed plans for money they would never legally receive. At exactly 8:30 p.m., when the dinner was reaching its celebratory peak and all the invited guests were present to witness the occasion, James Wilson arrived with his comprehensive legal team, sheriff's deputies, and an extensive package of legal documents that would completely shatter my stepfamily's evening and their assumptions about their financial future. Patricia Stewart, Emma Thompson, Sophie Thompson, and Michael Thompson, James announced in a voice that carried clearly through the private dining room. You are being served with legal papers for estate fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of assets belonging to Rachel Stewart, under the terms of David Stewart's legally binding will. The silence that followed was identical to the silence that had followed Patricia's announcement at David's funeral. But this time the shock and devastation were on their faces, as they realized their celebration was about to become a comprehensive legal reckoning with serious criminal and financial consequences. This is a court order immediately freezing all assets of David Stewart's estate and preventing any distribution of funds until Patricia Stewart's violations as executor can be thoroughly reviewed by the court, James continued, as deputies began documenting the gathering and serving legal papers on each family member involved in the conspiracy to steal from David's estate. The legal language was precise, comprehensive, and devastating, but the visual impact of watching their celebration being dismantled by law enforcement and legal professionals was even more powerful than the formal charges they were facing. Emma Thompson, your house purchase is being halted immediately due to your attempt to use stolen inheritance funds for the down payment, one of the deputies announced, as he handed her a thick stack of legal documents. Sophie Thompson, your European travel reservations are being canceled, and all funds are being recovered as proceeds of estate fraud. The systematic dismantling of their plans was both efficient and thorough. But what made the legal intervention even more impactful was the fact that it was happening in front of the same audience that had been celebrating their good fortune and praising their success just moments earlier. This is impossible, Patricia protested as she read through the comprehensive legal papers detailing her violations. I'm the court-appointed executor of David's estate. I have the legal authority and responsibility to distribute his assets according to his wishes and the needs of his family members. Mrs. Stewart, you have the legal obligation to distribute assets according to the will's specific and unambiguous instructions, not according to your personal opinions about who deserves the money or who needs financial support more, James replied, pulling out copies of David's actual will and reading the relevant sections aloud for all the dinner guests to hear clearly. The public reading of David's true intentions was devastating to Patricia's narrative and provided clear, undeniable evidence that her actions constituted deliberate theft rather than legitimate estate administration or wise family financial planning. David Stewart's will specifically and exclusively designates his daughter Rachel Stewart as the sole heir to his entire estate. James read to the assembled guests, his voice carrying clearly through the stunned dining room. There are absolutely no provisions for Emma, Sophie, or Michael Thompson, and no language whatsoever suggesting that the executor has any discretion to redistribute assets based on personal assessments of need, merit, or family circumstances. The legal reality was being exposed to the same audience that had witnessed Patricia's theft at the funeral and had been celebrating its anticipated results throughout the evening, creating public accountability that perfectly matched the public nature of her original betrayal and ongoing violations. Furthermore, James continued, the will includes specific language requiring that any executor who violates these clear instructions faces immediate removal from their fiduciary role, personal liability for estate fraud, and criminal prosecution for theft of inheritance assets. The comprehensive nature of David's legal planning was becoming clear to everyone present, demonstrating that he had anticipated the possibility of executor misconduct and had created multiple layers of legal safeguards to protect his true intentions and his daughter's legitimate inheritance rights. Emma, Sophie, and Michael were desperately trying to process the fact that their celebration dinner was turning into a criminal investigation. With their assumed windfalls being seized as evidence of their knowing participation in estate fraud, and their premature spending being documented as additional criminal behavior. "We didn't know we were doing anything illegal or wrong," Michael protested, as deputies continued documenting the gathering and photographing evidence of their premature spending. "Patricia told us that David wanted us to have this money, and that she had the legal authority to give it to us. We thought this was a legitimate inheritance distribution." Mr. Thompson, the law requires all beneficiaries to verify the legitimacy of any claimed inheritance before accepting or spending estate funds, one of the deputies replied while recording his statement. "Your premature spending of contested assets makes you personally liable for restitution and criminal prosecution, regardless of your claimed ignorance about the legal situation." The comprehensive legal education was happening in real time, with my stepfamily learning about concepts like fiduciary duty, beneficiary verification requirements, estate fraud penalties, and criminal liability while their dinner guests watched in complete shock and growing understanding of the magnitude of what they had attempted to do. But the most satisfying and meaningful moment came when I finally spoke, addressing the same audience that had witnessed Patricia's theft at David's funeral, and was now witnessing the complete legal and financial consequences of her actions and my stepfamily's participation in those violations. 3 months ago, my stepmother announced at my father's funeral that she was giving my legally designated inheritance to Emma, Sophie, and Michael, because they needed it more than I did, I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned gathering. Tonight, you're witnessing exactly what happens when someone tries to steal from a grieving daughter while exploiting her father's memory and violating his legally binding wishes. The deliberate parallel between the funeral announcement and the legal reckoning was creating the same kind of public exposure and accountability that Patricia had forced upon me during my most vulnerable moment. But this time, the consequences were falling on the people who had actually committed crimes rather than on their victim. As the evening concluded with my step-family facing comprehensive criminal charges, complete financial ruin, and total loss of their anticipated windfalls, I realized that David's legal planning had been even more sophisticated and protective than I had understood, ensuring that anyone who tried to steal from his daughter would face consequences that far exceeded whatever they thought they could gain through their theft. The comprehensive legal resolution that followed my stepfamily's disastrous celebration dinner moved through the court system with remarkable speed and efficiency, driven by overwhelming evidence of their crimes, clear documentation of their violations, and the undeniable clarity of David's legal intentions as expressed in his professionally drafted and legally bulletproof will. Patricia was convicted on multiple felony counts, including estate fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit theft, and elder abuse for exploiting David's death to steal from his designated heir. She received a suspended prison sentence of 5 years, extensive probation with strict financial monitoring, and permanent disbarment from serving as an executor or trustee for any estate in our state. The court finds that Patricia Stewart deliberately and systematically violated her fiduciary duties as executor, attempted to steal substantial assets designated for her stepdaughter, and exploited the victim's grief following her father's death to commit these serious crimes, the judge said during her sentencing hearing. This represents one of the most egregious and emotionally cruel cases of estate fraud this court has encountered. The judicial condemnation was both personally satisfying and professionally significant, creating important legal precedent that would protect other grieving heirs from similar exploitation by unscrupulous executors who might try to substitute their personal judgment for the clear legal instructions of the deceased. Emma, Sophie, and Michael faced severe civil and criminal liability for their enthusiastic participation in the theft, being required to pay comprehensive restitution for all money they had spent or committed, based on their expectation of receiving stolen funds, plus additional penalties and legal fees. Emma lost not only the house she had attempted to purchase with stolen money, but also faced additional financial penalties for breach of contract and fraudulent real estate transactions. Sophie's elaborate European vacation was not only cancelled, but resulted in substantial financial losses from non-refundable deposits and penalty fees that exceeded the original cost of her planned trip. Michael's premature business investments resulted in complete financial ruin, as his office lease, equipment purchases, and employee commitments created legal obligations that he could no longer meet after losing access to the inheritance money he had never been legally entitled to receive. The defendants' premature spending of contested inheritance funds demonstrates their conscious and deliberate participation in estate fraud, the civil court ruled during their restitution hearing. Their financial losses and legal obligations are the direct and predictable result of their decision to accept and spend money they had no legal right to receive. The financial consequences were comprehensive and lasting, but they were also perfectly proportional to the magnitude of their attempted theft and the emotional harm they had caused to both David's memory and my well-being during the most vulnerable period of my life. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of the legal resolution was the complete restoration of David's true intentions and the public vindication of his memory from people who had tried to exploit his death for their own financial benefit. Your father would be incredibly proud of how you fought to honor his wishes and protect his legacy from people who tried to exploit his death, James Wilson told me as we concluded the comprehensive legal proceedings. You demonstrated exactly the kind of strength, integrity, and determination he spent your entire lifetime developing and encouraging. Using the fully restored inheritance exactly as David had intended and planned, I expanded my marketing consulting business into a comprehensive agency that provides services to small businesses, nonprofit organizations, and community development projects throughout our region. The expansion created over 30 permanent jobs while helping local organizations achieve their missions more effectively and reach broader audiences. Rachel Stewart's agency has completely transformed our nonprofit's ability to reach donors, recruit volunteers, and communicate our impact to the community. The executive director of the regional children's charity told a business journal that was profiling my company's growth and community involvement. Her strategic expertise and genuine commitment to community impact reflect the same values and integrity her father demonstrated throughout his distinguished career. The professional recognition and business success were deeply gratifying, but even more important was knowing that David's inheritance was being used exactly as he had envisioned, to build a thriving business that would create lasting positive change while providing financial security and unlimited opportunities for my future. Have you ever realized that fighting for justice and refusing to accept exploitation ultimately led to outcomes that exceeded your original dreams while honoring the memory of someone you loved deeply? That's exactly what I experienced as David's legacy continued to create expanding positive impact through the business growth his inheritance had made possible. The most unexpected and wonderful development was the overwhelming community support I received from people who had witnessed Patricia's theft at the funeral, her subsequent legal consequences, and my determination to honor David's actual wishes rather than accepting her violations. Many of David's friends, business associates, and community connections reached out to offer partnerships, client referrals, strategic advice, and professional opportunities that accelerated my business growth far beyond what I could have achieved working alone. What your stepmother did at David's funeral was absolutely disgusting and unforgivable, one of his longtime business partners told me during a networking event where he introduced me to several potential major clients. But your response demonstrated exactly the kind of character, determination, and strategic thinking that David always said he was most proud of in you. We want to support businesses and leaders who reflect those values. The professional relationships and business opportunities that emerged from the crisis demonstrated that standing up to exploitation, fighting for justice, and refusing to accept theft can actually enhance your reputation and create opportunities that might never have existed otherwise. 5 years after David's death and Patricia's betrayal, I was invited to deliver the keynote address at the annual state conference on estate planning and elder law, speaking to an audience of attorneys, financial planners, and legal professionals about the importance of clear documentation and the serious consequences of executor misconduct. My father's careful and comprehensive estate planning didn't just protect his assets from theft, I told the audience of legal professionals. It also created multiple layers of consequences that ensured anyone who tried to exploit his death and steal from his daughter would face legal and financial repercussions that far exceeded whatever they thought they could gain through their crimes. The educational value of sharing my story was significant and professionally meaningful, but the most important aspect was knowing that David's experience was helping protect other families from similar betrayal, exploitation, and theft during their most vulnerable moments. As I concluded my presentation with a comprehensive tribute to David's integrity, business acumen, and sophisticated legal foresight, I realized that Patricia's attempt to steal my inheritance had ultimately created a legacy of protection, education, and positive change that extended far beyond our family's personal crisis. The legal precedent established by her conviction, the business expansion funded by the recovered inheritance, the jobs created through that growth, the community organizations served by my agency, and the educational impact of sharing our story had all contributed to positive changes that would benefit people for generations to come. The woman who had stood in shocked silence at her father's funeral, while her stepmother announced the theft of her inheritance, had become someone who used legal strategy, business success, professional speaking, and public education to ensure that David's values and legacy would continue creating positive impact long after Patricia's attempt to destroy them had been completely defeated. If you're reading this and you've experienced similar exploitation during your most vulnerable and grief-stricken moments, please know that you have both the right and the responsibility to fight back, even when doing so feels impossible or overwhelming. Sometimes the people who claim to love you most, who should be protecting you during your darkest hours, are actually the ones most willing to exploit your grief and vulnerability for their own benefit. Setting firm boundaries isn't cruel or ungrateful. It's absolutely necessary for protecting both your own well-being and the memory of those you've lost. Honoring someone's true wishes and legal instructions requires courage to stand up to people who would violate those wishes for their own advantage. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone's memory is to ensure their legacy is completely protected from people who would exploit it for personal gain. If this story resonated with your own experiences, please hit that subscribe button and share your experiences in the comments below. Have you ever had to fight for justice during a time of overwhelming grief? How did you handle situations where family members tried to exploit your vulnerability during your darkest moments? Your story might provide hope and guidance to someone else who's facing similar betrayal when they're least prepared to defend themselves. Thank you for joining me on this journey of grief, betrayal, legal justice, and ultimate triumph. Remember that protecting your loved one's true legacy and honoring their actual wishes is always worth fighting for, even when that fight seems impossible during your most vulnerable moments. See you in our next story here at Her Sweet Revenge.